Welcome to another episode of Sustainability Talks, the podcast at the heart of the environmental movement, brought to you by ETF Partners, Europe's leading impact venture capital firm. I'm your host, Rob Genieser, managing partner at ETF Partners. In our previous episodes, we have engaged in enlightening conversations with pioneers who are driving change in their respective fields. Today, we're excited to continue this tradition with an incredibly special guest, this time direct from Hollywood. Today, we're honored to welcome an outstanding contributor to Tinseltown, Jeffrey Nachmanoff. Jeff has made a significant mark in the world of film and television as a producer, writer, and director. He is well known for writing the screenplay for the 2004 blockbuster film The Day After Tomorrow, which is often cited as an ominous foretelling of today's climate emergency. The film grossed over $500 million, so it's fair to say you had an audience that was listening. In addition to his work on The Day After Tomorrow, Jeff has written and directed the film The Traitor, starring Don Cheadle, and directed the movie Replicas with Keanu Reeves. He is well known for his work on TV series productions, having variously written, directed, and produced for such shows as Homeland, Chicago Fire, and more recently, Daredevil Born Again for Marvel Studios. Jeff also happens to be my Harvard classmate and is a super person. So, whether you're a seasoned expert in sustainability, a film enthusiast, or simply curious about the climate crisis, this episode promises to offer a unique perspective that combines the world of entertainment with pressing global issues. Sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's episode of Sustainability Talks. Jeff, welcome. The first
Good
question
to
is
be
an
here.
obvious one. We graduate from university, people go off to be bankers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, some technologists. How come you went to Hollywood?
Well, Rob, as you know, I don't know that I had I was super excited about so many different things that I could never sort of focus on one thing. And filmmaking was, and it was sort of a little bit of a place I fell into out of not being able to choose. I was interested in storytelling. I was interested in photography. I had done a sort of documentary project when I was a senior as an undergrad, traveling around with a family circus and writing about it and taking pictures. None of those things really made me particularly qualified to go off and become a doctor or a banker or a lawyer or anything like that. And so I somehow or other found myself in Hollywood. It wasn't exactly a grand plan, but it was a way that I was able to kind of combine a lot of interest, mostly storytelling and working in a visual medium. And that's kind of how I ended up out here.
And so when you talk about storytelling, was your initial plan that you wanted to, if you would, make a difference through the work that you produced, or were you just trying to pay the bills?
Well, it started out really, I think I had both. I think I had aspirations to make stories that I could care about and that were about the things that interested me. But at the same time, I was realistic in the sense that I knew I needed to do something to pay the bills. So I found myself working in I start you know in commercial entertainment, and I like movies. I like entertaining movies. But the story of how I came to be involved with Day After Tomorrow is actually I tell it as a cautionary slash informative tale to younger screenwriters that I talk to, which is I got a call from a producer who was said, I'm looking for a screenwriter to come and work with Roland Emmerich on a movie he wants to make, a disaster movie. And to be perfectly honest, I could say this now, I was a little bit snooty. I was like, me do a disaster movie? I'm a very educated person. That seems like that would be something that would be for someone that's, somehow or other that I thought I was a little bit, you know, aiming higher. And but luckily, I say this, luckily I needed a job and I needed the work. So I had about a weekend to prepare for my meeting. So I sat down and I went to, back then it was the like Blockbuster, and I rented like all the disaster movies I could find and all of Roland's movies. And I sort of sat down, did a marathon session learning about disaster movies before I had the meeting. And when I went in and sat down with Roland, who was the famous writer director of Independence Day, um, he was nothing like I expected. First of all, as I tell people who say, "Oh, Roland Emmerich, he makes big, spectacular disaster movies. What's he like?" I said, "Well, he's a very, very smart man." For example, when I talked to him for the first time, we started talking about books and literature, and as I say to people, he reads Goethe in the original German and in English. Do you? Because I don't. His range of curiosity and education is really impressive. And what I realized is he happens to love this genre of movie making. But it is in no way because he's not thinking about the world or about other things in a much broader way.
And so when you set out to tell the story, how did you balance the need, if you would, to be scientifically pure yet audience friendly? I guess audience friendly means scaring people in the context of a disaster movie.
Well, I would sort of take issue with the idea of the need to be scientifically pure at all. This is a movie coming out of the genre of things, there had been obviously Roland's movie Independence Day, there had been Armageddon, there had been Deep Impact, two movies in which the world was destroyed or threatened to be destroyed by asteroids hitting the planet, and one of which I believe Bruce Willis goes up and sets off a nuclear bomb to save the planet in the asteroid as it hurtles towards Earth. So the bar for what I would say is, scientific accuracy was never something that was put out there for us. We imposed a little bit of that on ourselves in the sense that I think that, just to most of your viewers probably know this, but very briefly, the whole concept behind Day After Tomorrow is a riff on a scientific theory which neither I nor Roland came up with. It really is based on the work of a scientist named Wally Brecker, a very prominent climate scientist who was a professor at Columbia, who initially proposed a theory, which at the time was rather shocking to climatologists or paleoclimatologists, that it is possible for the climate to shift abruptly. So abruptly in scientific terms, it means it doesn't necessarily take millions of years for the climate to shift. It could happen in a single generation, which at the time was not something that people really, not everybody embraced that idea. And in particular, he had discovered that by studying ice core samples, there had been a significant and rapid shift about 12,000 years ago in the climate as a result of a collapse of the ocean circulation system, which is called the Atlantic Meridional Ocean Overturning Circulation, as a result of the melting glaciers in the North Atlantic coming from the Arctic Circle, and that changing the salinity in the water, which could actually disrupt the sort of circuit, the conveyor belt of water that moves energy from the tropics up to the North Atlantic. And as a result, it would rapidly plunge Europe and the East Coast of the United States into a very, very different, much colder climate. We took that idea and sort of ran with it and said, well, if that were to happen today, and the theory was there was a very, very remote chance that it could happen as a result of anthropogenic or human-induced global warming, it would have a disastrous effect on the weather patterns and, of course, the climate and a lot of other things. And we said to make this into a digestible scenario for a disaster movie, let's show it happening all in a matter of weeks. Now, in some ways, that's, of course, a crazy contraction of the timeline of what would be real. In other ways, it really isn't that big a jump, because when you think about an abrupt climate shift and you take it from millions of years down to, let's say, 50 years, well, the difference between a million years and 50 years is not that difference between a million years and 5 weeks. It was a way to sort of humanize this idea of what could happen if this particular very, very unlikely but disastrous scenario played out. And that was the inspiration for the script.
And Jeff, some of the things you actually pointed to as potentially happening, I believe, have come to pass. So, for example, I believe one of the early scenes is depicting the lead character on the Larsen B ice shelf, and it begins to melt underneath him. And I believe that's exactly what's happened in the last few years. So how does it feel actually to be somewhat of a soothsayer? And do you think there's more coming that your movie sort of spoke to?
Well, it's funny you say that. People send me emails with the latest headlines in which, sometimes it will reference the movie. It's been almost 20 years since the movie came out, and people, there was just about a month ago, There was a study which said, day after tomorrow scenario, or, scenario depicted in a Hollywood movie is scientists warn is, becoming closer to becoming reality. Obviously, it is nobody wants to predict bad things happening and have them come true. And I don't really see the movie as so much a prediction. It was more of a shining a spotlight on some of the risks that real scientists had already been talking about and publishing about, but they weren't getting a lot of attention. We chose a particularly dramatic one in order to get people's attention and make an entertaining disaster movie. The example of the Larsen B ice shelf collapse is a really interesting one because I was reading in the sort of the current scientific journals and popular science magazines about, so where are we going to set an opening scene? And one of the things that they said is, well, at some point, maybe in the next 20 or 30 years, scientists believe the Larsen B might collapse. So we put that into the script. Literally before the movie came out, the Larsen B collapsed. So it happened, on a schedule 20, 30 years ahead of what the sort of journals had been predicting, which is often the way it is with climate models. They can never get it exactly perfectly right, and they tend to be a little bit conservative, to be honest. So even, when I started this project, I didn't come into this as some sort of climate expert. I did my own research. I talked to some amazing people, and I got access to some experts that I would probably never have gotten to speak to had I not been working on this project, which was great and educational for me. But like most people at the time, I didn't have a deep understanding of the risks that climate change posed. In fact, climate change wasn't really even in vogue at the time. It was still referred to mostly as global warming then. And obviously we've kind of come to realize that there are different, we call it the climate crisis, and the language around climate change has changed as as scientists have realized that they have an obligation to become communicators. And has been an interesting thing for me, Rob, is learning how you can get into a field for one reason. I mean, this is maybe, I don't know how much we want to talk about you and what you're doing, but that you start out saying, oh, I want to go into finance or business. I want to make money. I want to invest people's, resources in a way to get a good return. And then maybe somewhere along the way, you say, well, maybe there's an opportunity to also leverage that money to do something that has a positive impact on the planet.
Yeah, I think we'll return to that maybe near the end of the conversation, but I still want to come back to your 2004 period because you're out there with your story, talking about what we now call the climate emergency in your own way, let's say. Meanwhile, you had groups like Exxon who were out saying, it wasn't real. I found a quote from 2004 where they said, scientific uncertainties preclude determinations regarding the human role in relevant climate change. I'm not sure what's the difference between relevant climate change and irrelevant climate change. But did you ever feel like you're in a debate with the climate deniers or the people that weren't looking at the science? Again, not maybe so much through the movie, but through the stance that you started to take.
Yes, that's an interesting point. It's good to go back for a moment to that time. I would say two things. One, that quote you gave from Exxon, that is a great example of essentially just, that was corporate agitprop. And it's been well documented. There was an extraordinary and successful campaign, which was modeled on the campaign, I believe, that the tobacco industry used to try and move public opinion to maintain corporate profits from the fossil fuels industry. That's not super controversial, at least among most people that you talk to, I think, who've researched it now. The interesting thing was, what do you do to combat corporate propaganda or corporate fake news? And the answer is you have to tell a different story. And that, in some ways, is where I believe Hollywood comes in. What we do, what Roland Emmerich does, and what I do in a movie like Day After Tomorrow, is our version of combating, not in the sort of not on the op-ed pages, not in a scientific debate, but in a way to kind of move the conversation in a different direction. We always knew that the movie was not an educational tool; it's an awareness tool. At the time, less than half of Americans thought of climate change as a significant problem in America, or that was a case where the fossil fuels industry was winning the battle, generally speaking. Dick Cheney was vice president. There's the funny character we created a sort of a look-alike character for Dick Cheney. I actually used some of Dick Cheney's own words in one scene where the character is at the climate conference, sort of a little fake version of a cop back there in India. And in a way, by taking it on from a slightly less serious point of view, I think it's one way to get people to sort of acknowledge at least that this is something to be talked about. Now, of course, we got attacked from both sort of the, let's say, the left and the right, in the sense that people who were, really wanting to be climate deniers said, well, this movie is just, is Hollywood hysteria made by Hollywood liberals. And interestingly, on the side, a lot of environmental groups were worried that by making it into a piece of entertainment, that we would trivialize the issue and give them an easy target to say, that's not true at all. And I was put out there kind of on the circuit by the director and the producer, who maybe just didn't want to do all of the interviews on this subject. So I ended up kind of engaging with a lot of people on this subject and saying, look, we're not here to tell you that this is the exact science. We're telling a story. And the overall story has a basic truth in it, which is to really, really become reductive about it. If you poke Mother Nature with a stick, eventually she is going to, react. And that is, that's something that a lot of scientists were having a lot of trouble figuring out how to talk to people about. So as I said, at the time when the movie came out, I was talking 20 years ago, fewer than half of Americans think of climate change as a significant threat. Today, that's gone up to well over half. I think it's something around 55% on the Pew Trust. The problem is, or one of the sort of unfortunate things that's happened in the intervening time, is that there's become this huge ideological split. So even though the number has gone up, the split between Dems and Republicans has widened greatly. So it's like 1 in 4 Republicans consider climate change a significant priority for the country, whereas 8 in 10 Democrats do. They used to be much closer to parity. And remember, this was, if you can cast your memory back that far, remember the McCain-Lieberman Stewardship Act? That was 2004. This was not this was a bipartisan, non-politicized issue, not that long ago. And we don't have to go into the details of exactly how it happened, but it clearly became something that one side decided to sort of take advantage of for political reasons, and they sort of just chose a side.
Jeff, a few reactions to your comments. I think if the left doesn't like you and the right doesn't like you, you must be doing something right, because you're probably sitting happily in the middle, which is where most of America probably should be, and perhaps most of the world. But I'm also intrigued by that Dick Cheney quote, because I think I found it, or the quote that I think your VP uses in the movie. He said, our economy is every bit as fragile as the environment. And I think suggesting that the cost of doing something about the climate emergency would be too high. And perhaps there would be a threat to, if you would, American or global prosperity. And I think that's part of the argument that largely the right uses today to stop progress when it comes to enacting sustainable legislation or supporting businesses. But I guess my question to you is that what you're getting at there? That people will just try to protect the status quo, their way of life, and it's hard to move forward.
Yes, I think so. And if you're going to quote my movie back at me, I'll quote the response that I gave to the protagonist. And he says, well, sir, the cost of doing nothing is even higher, or something like that. Said much better by Dennis Quaid in the movie. And I believe that is the kind of correct answer based on my research. Again, not being an economist, not being a policymaker, but you don't have to be to see the the extraordinary cost. It's very similar to health, or just on a personal level. Like, we all know we probably shouldn't eat that extra cheeseburger or have that, one more thing, that's bad for you, but we don't see the effect right away. But you do see statistically over time, when you have poor health habits, poor diet, the outcome is that you have a shorter and less healthy life. So I think when we look at sort of the economy, and obviously the challenge is knowing which painful choices you have to make. Trying to figure out how to get off of a carbon-based, energy system is a super difficult and complex sort of problem, which I'm not going to pretend to have sort of the exact solution for. But I think on the flip side, when you say, well, what is the not doing anything has consequences as well, and those consequences are visible. When you look at the number of we used extreme weather events for dramatic effect in the movie as a way to kind of depict some of the consequences of climate change. Many of those, whether it's Hurricane Sandy, whether it's the fires out here in California, whether it's many unprecedented and extreme, and the heat domes, extreme weather events are, if not individually linked to climate change, clearly statistically linked, in the sense that their probability just is, most scientists will tell you we couldn't have these many extreme weather events without the anthropogenic warming that's resulted. So the real world effects are here. They're not future effects. And unfortunately, again, most of your listeners, anyone listening to this podcast knows, they are felt disproportionately in the global South. They are, they result in significant loss of life all around the world already. So the question is not, how much does it cost to take another path? It's like, well, whatever it costs, we know what the costs are of continuing on this path, and they are pretty scary. If you read the IPCC reports, they're not cheery.
And so, are you ever interested in making another movie that starts to, if you would, present some of these issues, what some of the solutions could be, either in a, call it, dramatic way, or maybe more along the lines of Inconvenient Truth in a more, I don't know, factual way? I mean, how do you think about how you should express that? And, are people willing to bankroll it?
It's an interesting question I think about a lot. I will tell you a small side story that you'll probably like, which is that while we were doing the screenings right before the movie came out for Day After Tomorrow, we were invited to a small room where those of us who had made the film and a few other people in Hollywood got to hear a little slideshow presented by Al Gore. And some of the people in that room said, well, someone should film this as a documentary. That was the birth of Inconvenient Truth. That resulted, I think it was Scott Burns was the one who ended up directing, or no, Davis Guggenheim. But that was sort of an outgrowth a little bit of this movie.
And Jeff, that's actually a 2006 release, so 2 years after yours. So it's amazing how you inspired it. But I'm willing to bet, although I can't say this as a fact, but I bet more people have seen your movie than theirs.
Many more people saw the movie, but that's they're really different different strokes for different folks. I think that there's a saying in Hollywood, which is, if you want to send a message, try Western Union. And that truism is that, movies, commercial movies, entertaining movies, if they become too preachy, if they become too much of an after school special, people aren't going to pay to see that. So you have to make a story first that grabs people's attention. And if you can embed some ideas or thoughts inside that movie, great. But when you put the message first, you're no longer making a movie. You're making just a straight up, propaganda piece. I think that one of the interesting things with Roland Emmerich's insight when he made for this movie was the same as the one he had kind of was scratching at when he made Independence Day, where Will Smith fights the aliens, as you probably remember. And his insight was essentially that only in the face of a global threat to humanity do people of different nations stop warring with one another and unite. And you could say that, that movie, if you look back at it now, it's a fun movie. The ending is a little corny, perhaps, with all the different, people from the, all around the world. I think he's got Israelis and Arabs together fighting the aliens, saying all the most intractable conflicts in the world would be abandoned in the face of a global unified threat. And obviously doing that with aliens was sort of a fun way to do it, by taking the threat of climate change and making climate change the villain rather than an asteroid or an alien. What he was doing, and I think we were trying to do, is say, look, you can take these same tropes of disaster filmmaking and use it to point out we don't need aliens to unify humans. We don't need an asteroid to unify humanity. We have our very own self-made disaster looming. And if we don't unite to solve it, we will suffer the consequence. Obviously, about 20 years later, Adam McKay makes Don't Look Up, which is sort of a satiric version on the same thing. Whereas it's come full circle. In that case, he's taking the asteroid and making it into climate change. These are all ways, whether or not you like that movie or not, they're all ways to try and get people to sort of engage with a subject. It's so easy. I mean, we've talked about this before. It's so easy to sort of take a doomerist attitude and say, look, I just can't think about this. I've got to, that whatever, my kid is sick today, or I've got to walk the dog, or I've got to deal with taxes. There's so many things that, come first that are immediate, everyday to day problems. Thinking about this very, very large, seemingly intractable problem, it's quite easy to turn away from it. So one of the functions of entertainment, like Day After Tomorrow, is and was just to get people to look over in that direction again. I think that there's a time and a place for, I guess, caution, what I would call scare movies, which is where the category that I put this into a little bit. There's a time and a place for humor, like Adam McKay's movie, and there are informative movies like Inconvenient Truth. I don't think any one type of film is the sort of essential. You need all of them, and it's just a different way to use the the medium of film to try and sort of tackle something that requires, there's not a magic, I don't believe there's a magic bullet solution. It's a yes and it's everything. It's all of the different things you can throw at it to try and both move public opinion and ultimately move the needle to try and put us on a better path.
And Jeff, you've taught me a little bit about activist fiction,
Yeah.
particularly the solar punk genre. And I think you're going to have to explain to many listeners what that is and why it's interesting to you.
Yeah, so there's a phrase, I don't know who invented it, but I've heard other people use it, called solar punk. And that describes sort of the prime example that I've read that I thought was really interesting, and I'd recommend it to your listeners, is Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry of the Future, in which he essentially, it's a take on climate change. It shows a lot of the current and theoretical kind of catastrophic effects of climate change as temperatures rise. But what it also does is it kind of weaves into a fictional narrative real life possible solutions, and it sketches out a future in which humanity kind of goes close to the brink and then changes course. So, and some of it's really wonky. He goes into carbon coin and monetary systems and ways to incentivize people to, ways to incentivize the capital markets to invest differently, which is really more up your alley. And it also talks about, the ideas like, geoengineering solutions or possible fixes. It also talks about really interesting and hard to imagine in this moment in time, but possible collective ideas. Like you've heard of that, like rewilding areas of the planet. What's like the 30-30 goal of 30% of the lands are supposed to be returned for to preserve ecology or ecological diversity in 30 years. I think that there's I'm forgetting the name of that program, but these ideas are all real world solutions. And I think by putting them into a fictional narrative, he's putting it out there, not so much that this one, or this one is going to happen or needs to happen, but that there are things that could happen that could be different. There are ways that you can move forward, and just sort of showing people that there are solutions is as important as showing people that there are problems.
Yeah, and so I think you're bringing me to my day job, which is that of a
Hmm.
venture capitalist trying to find great entrepreneurs that can help innovate and solve the problems of the day. So, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic that innovation can play a role in getting us out of this major challenge. But feel free to comment more on that.
I think that there's something that's I will say this I think most people, as you said, I get attacked a little bit from the left and the right, so I'm happy to play the role of contrarian. When it comes to the left, I feel, and the sort of let's call it the traditional environmental movement. I think what is that phrase? A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. We have to adapt and change our positions as circumstances change. So when I was a kid, I had the No Nukes record and probably had a few T-shirts and things. I've become convinced, like a lot of people who've kind of been reading in the environmental movement, that nuclear energy is a part of the solution to our energy crisis, because it may not be perfect, and there's certainly the chance of of disaster, but look at the alternatives. We need energy that's not carbon intensive and it's not fossil fuels based, and we need it now. And nuclear has to be a part of that solution. There are some people who are really traditional environmentalists who would tie themselves to a tree before they'd ever accept that nuclear energy could be part of the fix. I think in the same way, when it comes to capital markets, you need to realign incentives with the good of of the species. And sometimes that means that certain people are going to get rich that you may not be happy about. It may not feel that fair. But if I could say to you, Rob, if we had a global fund that would pay Exxon, BP, Shell, all these people, all these companies that have essentially created a lot of this problem of fossil fuel extraction, that we could make them even richer just to keep it in the ground, that was the most effective way to do it. What do you say about that? I mean, a part of me says, fine. I maybe it's not nice that those people who didn't sort of do anything good for the world are going to get even richer. But if that's the solution, if that's the best way to save the planet, you can't let your sort of, these sort of micro feelings necessarily get in the way.
I think the Dick Cheney character would have said something akin to "Can we afford it?" So,
Well, right, but the Dick Cheney, I'd say pay the Dick Cheney character. There are people in the environmental movement who would say that bastard needs to go down for what he's done to the planet. But in a weird way, you have to be a little more, kind of coldly analytical about it. So, well, maybe the answer is you pay Halliburton twice as much in order to not destroy the rainforest or whatever it is they're doing. I think that it's about harnessing the power of capital markets to incentivize, corporate actors to do what we want them to do. The problem right now is, and this is a challenge in a complex interrelated global economy, is it's simply incentives are misaligned. If you can make X amount of money right now by doing something that will pass that cost along to someone else or to the next, or someone else in time or space, it's really hard to get people to act differently or to avoid those costs. It's like the classic, what is that, the tragedy of the commons? The idea that if no one, whatever the external prices of fuel of an extraction economy, let's just keep it simple with fossil fuels, if they're not borne by the shareholders, then or they're not borne directly by the shareholders, it's really hard to get companies to change their behavior.
yeah, and Jeff, I admire the passionate erudite comment, but bringing it back to your day job of sitting in Hollywood and telling stories, can you get that into a story somehow?
Uh, I don't know. I think you can, in general, you can tell a story about almost anything. I think if you can create if you can create characters that are compelling enough for the audience to watch. Um, but I haven't seen a lot of really I've tried to write things about, like, for example, stories like about money laundering and what it comes down to is like no one really follows or understands the money laundering part of it. What they know is at some point some guy with a gun is coming to shoot some other guy and because they've done something illegal. They don't necessarily follow the minutia of financial markets. I mean, I don't know if you like what was Adam McKay's film with not Too Big to Fail. What was the name of the film about the market, about the 2008 collapse?
It was The Big Short.
Yeah, The Big Short. Thanks. The Big Short to me is an example of a movie that takes on a really complicated and difficult to absorb subject, but the way it does it using humor and satire and breaking the fourth wall, it made it a hit and people watched it. So I believe it's possible to do, but it's tricky because I think for many people, his other movie, Don't Look Up, which I found very entertaining, I think that was more divisive, and I think people had a harder time because they could feel his agenda so kind of clearly in that movie that if you were trying to talk to people on multiple sides of the issue, I don't know that it was able to reach across and get people to engage.
And you mentioned, when you write a film or direct a film, or even produce a film, you're thinking about your audience. Do you actually try to reach a global audience with these messages, or are you thinking, there's a group that pays, and I got to make sure they're the people we target?
Well, I think it depends on the kind of entertainment you're making. There's certain things that are designed to be, they say, 4-quadrant movies. You probably heard that phrase, meaning, old, young, male, female. But there are other movies that are and entertainment that are really targeted to a smaller demographic. And with there's a different conversation, but with the explosion of sort of streaming and other on-demand services, people can really find very specific entertainment that for better and for worse, that speaks to their tastes and interests. The good news is that means there's going to be this super small LGBTQ forward movie made by a Black filmmaker, like Moonlight, that maybe a certain group of people are going to watch. You're not going to get a lot of the people who go to the MAGA rallies to watch that movie, but you have enough people to finance the movie and for it to find an audience. The bad news, of course, like with everything else in our fractured sort of political landscape, is everybody starts, it's just as everyone has their own news source, everyone has their own facts, everyone has their own entertainment. As a result, some of the things, like a movie like Day After Tomorrow, which was a pretty broad hit that was probably watched by an equal number, I would imagine, of people today that would identify as Republican or Democrats, that's harder to do now. And I think what happens is you see a movie, even if there's a hint or a whiff of something political about it, one side or the other is going to react and say, I don't want to watch that piece of entertainment. So that idea that everyone goes and talks about the episode of, I don't know, make it up, ER or Seinfeld or whatever was on, like when we were younger, that, there was a lot of collective watching of things. Now you have people kind of each in their own space, watching both news and even entertainment that kind of fits their worldview a little more closely. So it's a little bit more of a difficult line to walk to try and make entertainment that's going to reach a broader audience.
All right, so I think it's almost time for the end here, but I have to ask about the future. What's it hold for you, Jeff? What are you either going to be working on? I must say the Marvel show sounded very interesting. But also maybe in our world of climate. I think I asked earlier about if you could do something, what would it be? But any specific ideas that you're kicking around?
I'm really interested in in technology and the intersection of technology and AI and climate change. I wonder whether, again, I'm sort of like a science geek who's not a scientist. I often get myself quickly out of my depth and don't understand what I'm reading about. But I like to read about and talk to people who are in fields of cutting edge technology. And I think there might be some both possible sort of ways to harness some of the newest sort of innovations in technology, and because they can all be used for good or for ill, if you will, and seeing what might be possible there in terms of thinking of, let's say, science fiction scenarios that could look forward. I'm also still interested in the dark science fiction scenarios. I'm a big fan of Black Mirror, which is often looking at the worst outcomes of technology. And I'm not opposed to also working, and I've collaborated a little bit in this post Day After Tomorrow in the field of kind of climate change education and awareness and solutions that may not be exactly in the field of mainstream entertainment, because I think that there's room for, as you were kind of alluding to, maybe there's a way to use some of the skills I've developed as a storyteller to help. I've done a little bit of this, like, I have a friend in the United Nations Environmental Program, and I've done a little bit of work with them, trying to find ways to communicate to people on both the micro and the macro level about climate change solutions and, of course, adaptations, which is a big part of the conversation now too.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jeff. That was fabulous.
Lots of fun to talk to you, Rob, and we'll do it again soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.